It's my privilege to welcome Dr. Daniel B. Coupland, who's an associate professor of education at Hillsdale College. He received his PhD in education from Michigan State University, and at Hillsdale, he serves as an advisor for the classical education minor and the liberal arts teacher apprenticeship, in addition to serving as a consultant for the college's charter school initiative. He also serves on the board of directors of the Society for Classical Learning and on the editorial board for Arts of Liberty, a journal on liberal arts and liberal education. In 2013, Dr. Coupland was voted Professor of the Year by Hillsdale's senior class. Please welcome me in joining Dr. Daniel Coupland.
Well, thank you for the great introduction. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Common Core, and I'd be happy to answer your questions at the end. On May 29th, 2009, Arne Duncan, the new Secretary of Education for the Obama administration, gave a speech at the National Press Club here in Washington, D.C. In the speech, he said, quote, "We want to raise the bar dramatically in terms of high standards. What we have as a country, I'm convinced, is what we call a race to the bottom. We have 50 different standards, 50 different goalposts, and due to political pressure, those have all been dumbed down. We want to fundamentally reverse that. We want common, career-ready, internationally benchmarked standards." In this short paragraph, the Secretary of Education identified the problems of the past and set a new vision for education in this country. He correctly assessed the damage created in the Bush administration's education policy from 2002, known as No Child Left Behind, or NCLB. While supporters of NCLB can point to limited success in a few areas, the Bush administration's education policy left the nation's schools a bureaucratic mess. In the National Press Club speech, the new Secretary of Education was arguing that the mess was created by what he and others have called a patchwork of state standards that left the states to compete in a fundamentally flawed and unfair process for limited federal funds. Secretary Duncan's argument presented at the National Press Club and elsewhere was very persuasive to those in the education community who had suffered under the separate but very unequal policies of the era known as No Child Left Behind. 4 years later, after the 2009 speech, all but a handful of states have signed on to a common set of curriculum standards known as Common Core. Common Core will now provide the framework for what students will learn in math and English language arts, but it'll also establish 2 federally funded and approved tests that will replace what states currently use to measure their students' academic success. Afraid to be left out of the new education marketplace, private companies are quickly trying to align themselves with Common Core standards. In order to survive in the Common Core era, the textbook publishers and other related industries must show how their materials align with Common Core. SAT and ACT tests are now aligned with Common Core as well. And those who think they can avoid Common Core by having their children attend private schools or by homeschooling should think again. The Iowa test of the basic skills and Stanford 10, 2 very popular tests with private schools and with homeschoolers, will also be aligned to Common Core. Within a few short years, Common Core has gone from virtual unknown to national education powerhouse that may influence the formal education of some 50 million K-12 students in America. In the next few minutes, I'll try to give you some insight on what Common Core is, what the major arguments are, both for and against, And I'll also try to show how these arguments are missing the most important ideas about education altogether. But first, I'll start with a brief history. The idea of a rich educational experience has its roots deep in American history. The founders of this country believed an informed citizenry was necessary for good government. In the 1800s, Horace Mann continued this legacy by arguing for widespread public education. In the late 1800s, politicians and social leaders looked to the schools to solve pressing social needs brought on by industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. Many leading education theorists of the late 19th and early 20th century, including John Dewey, William H. Kilpatrick, G. Stanley Hall, and others, developed and promoted progressive solutions to these pressing social needs. For the first half of the 20th century, progressive theories such as child-centered teaching and practical work-related curricula pretty much dominated the education landscape. In October 1957, the United States was awakened from its educational malaise when the Soviet Union successfully launched Sputnik, the first space satellite, into orbit. This one event signaled America's educational decline and brought attention to the need for a return to rich content, at least in the fields of math, science, and foreign languages. But these reforms were quickly lost in the cultural turmoil of the 1960s and 70s, and schools once again offered a smorgasbord of academically weak classes. Students were earning academic credit in courses titled Personal Relationships, What's Happening, and Girl Talk. And they were receiving academic credit for extracurricular activities in student government, mass media, and cheerleading. In 1983, the National Commission on Excellence in Education published a landmark study on American education titled A Nation at Risk, which warned that our country's economic, cultural, and political future was threatened by our weak education system. The report stated the now famous lines, quote, "Our nation is at risk. The educational foundations of society are presently being eroded by the rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and a people. If an unfriendly power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre education performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war," end quote. A Nation at Risk signaled a turning point in American education and brought about renewed concentration on what America's children should know and be able to do. E.D. Hirsch's 1987 book, Cultural Literacy, argued that schools should concentrate on the basics and pass along core knowledge that every educated American should know. But many in the education establishment resisted these content-based reforms and continued to push a progressive agenda in America's schools. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1980s and the end of the Cold War, many countries had greater opportunities to participate in the global marketplace. Globalization led to international comparisons across a variety of indicators, including in education. Many Asian countries with whom we were now competing seemed to be moving further and further ahead of the United States. One of the obvious features of the education in these countries was the existence of clear national standards. Many reformers pushed the idea in the United States, or that if the United States was going to compete in the international marketplace, the quality of education in the entire country would have to improve. They also concluded that such improvement would only occur if students were held to high academic standards. In 1989, President George Bush the Senior hosted an educational conference conference for the nation's governors on academic standards and testing. A charismatic governor from Arkansas named William Jefferson Clinton took the lead in crafting a set of goals for increasing academic achievement in America. And when Clinton defeated Bush for the presidency 3 years later, the new president used these goals to craft his signature education policy known as Goals 2000. Goals 2000 provided money for each state to develop its own standards that were based on a national template. Critics of the initiative claimed that this effort violated the long-standing principle established by the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, that education was the responsibility of the states. But the Clinton administration countered that the national standards were meant only to be a template for the standards, for the states to follow, and each state was ultimately responsible for its own standards. Interestingly, Goals 2000 also authorized the creation of an approval board that would certify state standards that they had actually matched the national template. The approval board, however, never materialized because in the 1994 midterm election, the Republicans gained the majority in Congress, and they quickly abolished the entire board. Even without the federal board, the effort to create state standards that were based on a national template continued. In the mid-1990s, professional subject-specific organizations released national standards in history, English, and math. The general public assumed that these standards would represent the basic knowledge and skills that students would need in these specific areas. But they soon discovered that these professional organizations had used this project to push unproven and perhaps radical ideas within the academic fields. Public opposition to these national standards spread quickly. Most states avoided the controversy of the national standards by creating their own unique standards. If there was one thing in common across these state standards, it was their emphasis on less controversial skills, such as critical thinking, cooperative learning, and shared understanding, rather than concrete statements about specific ideas, people, and the books that students should read. In 2001, President George Bush Jr. pushed his education policy known as No Child Left Behind, or NCLB, which, like those before it, promised to increase student achievement by encouraging states to set high standards and develop tests that were based on those standards. But unlike the initiatives that had come before it, NCLB required states to test all students in particular subjects at particular grade levels in order to receive money. Looking back, most education experts, both on the right and the left, concluded that NCLB had failed to deliver real and lasting success. NCLB created an environment where teaching to the test became the status quo. And what made matters worse was that from state to state, the tests were all different. Under NCLB, each state had its own academic standards that it was expected to meet. And because the money was based on each state meeting its own standards, there was little motivation for states to keep the academic standards high. In an effort to show higher proficiency in student achievement, states began lowering proficiency levels in what the Secretary of Education referred to as a race to the bottom. And by the end of the decade, many in the education community were looking for alternatives to the separate and unequal approach to standards from NCLB. In 2007, two trade organizations, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, began work on a common set of curricular standards in English language arts and math. In December of 2008, these two groups produced a document on national standards that would guide the new administration during its transition into office. 2 months later, the Secretary of Education announced a new grant program known as Race to the Top. The name was an obvious nod to the failures of No Child Left Behind. The program included money from the 2009 stimulus bill, which was used by the states to improve academic standards and tests. In order to receive the Race to the Top grant, states had to commit to, quote, a set of content standards that define what students must know and be able to do that are substantially identical across all states in a consortium, end quote. In 2011, the Obama administration made the decision to adopt common standards even easier. Most states were still obligated to meet the onerous NCLB requirements. The U.S. Department of Education promised NCLB waivers to states that adopted common set of college and career-ready standards and assessments. And while the U.S. Department of Education did not require states to adopt the Common Core standards, these standards were and still are the only standards that met the Education Department's criteria. 45 states and the District of Columbia adopted the Common Core standards. Minnesota adopted the English Language Arts standards, but it rejected the math standards. Initially, only Alaska and Texas rejected Common Core, but in the end, Virginia and Nebraska did too. The idea of common academic standards across all states is quite appealing to many in the field of education, because it seems to cure some obvious and long-standing problems. Allow me to highlight two of the most important. First, in our mobile society, it makes it very easy for people to pick up and move. As E.D. Hirsch points out, quote, in a typical American school district, the average rate at which students transfer in and out of schools during an academic year is about 1/3. In a typical urban school, only about half of the students who start in September are still there in May. When students move from school to school, especially when these moves are across state lines, they often experience a fractured education filled with huge gaps and boring repetitions. However, if all schools are meeting the same academic standards, the students have a greater chance at a relatively consistent education, regardless of where they move within the country. In theory, students should be able to move from Maine to California with very little interruption in their education. Number two, for years, the United States has lagged behind many of the industrialized countries in key academic areas such as math and science. Since Sputnik, policymakers have tried to craft a coherent plan to improve our country's standing in the world. But they have struggled to do this in light of the patchwork of state standards. Pointing to the failures of NCLB, proponents of Common Core argue that having a common set of academically rigorous standards for the entire country would allow the policymakers to craft a coherent plan for improving American education. Many corporate leaders and policymakers argue that if we are unable to compete as a nation in a global, many corporate leaders and politicians argue that we are unable to compete as a nation in a global society if every state is doing its own thing. the arguments against Common Core. As you can probably guess, Common Core has its critics, who typically concentrate on one or more of the following concerns. Number one, cost. Critics claim that Common Core will be very expensive to implement and maintain. The only study on the cost of implementing Common Core and its tests across the nation estimate the price tag of $16 billion over 7 years. But the truth of the matter is that no one really knows what the final price tag will be. For this reason and others, critics have already labeled this program Obama Core. Critics of Common Core charge that most states acted irresponsibly when they chose to adopt the standards because they did not have a firm understanding of the price tag. Many states saw the race to the top money as a way to pay for immediate education expenses, but they failed to see that they were signing on for something far worse. Number two, quality. Critics argue that rather than pushing states towards high standards, Common Core is encouraging a coalescence at the mediocre middle. For example, while Mississippi standards appear to be getting stronger, Massachusetts, the standards in Massachusetts get weaker. A few curriculum experts, including Zev Werman, Sandra Stotsky, James Milgram, have examined the math and English language arts standards very carefully, and they discovered some alarming concerns. In fact, because of these concerns and others, Stotsky and Milgram, who served on the Common Core's validation committee, refused to sign the validation report. Number three, privacy. The 2009 stimulus bill required states to begin tracking students in a database, starting with their preschool years to the entry into the workforce. The database will link students' results on Common Core related tests to other private personal information. The database will be available to a wide variety of people within the government. While supporters of Common Core claim that the system employs a variety of measures to protect the anonymity of students, critics have pointed to studies that demonstrate how these measures may not be as secure as supporters assume. However, the larger issue remains about whether collecting this kind of information is consistent with the role of government that we have in this country. Number four, constitutionality. The biggest concern of Common Core critics to date has been the ever-increasing role of the national government in education. The 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution established the principle that the power to oversee education belongs to the states. This longstanding principle of local control of education is reiterated throughout our laws and our government codes. For generations, Americans have understood that the constitutional authority for education rests with the states or local government, not the federal government. Critics of Common Core see that these standards are federal overreach and a violation of both the letter and the spirit of federal education law and the U.S. Constitution. Supporters of Common Core like to portray these critics as far-right extremists who are paranoid about a government takeover. But this is not true. Diane Ravich, a respected historian of education, is hardly the darling of the right, especially recently. On February 26th of this year, Ravich wrote the following piece titled Why I Oppose Common Core Standards. Her comments below give a general overview of many of the central concerns that most critics have. I'm going to quote her at length. Quote, I have long advocated for voluntary national standards, believing that it would be helpful to states and to school districts to have general guidelines about what students should know and be able to do as they progress through school. Such standards, I believe, should be voluntary, not imposed by the federal government. For the past 2 years, I have steadfastly insisted that I was neither for nor against Common Core. I was agnostic. I wanted to see how they worked in practice. After much deliberation, I have come to the conclusion that Common Core standards effort is fundamentally flawed by the process with which they have been foisted upon the nation, end quote. Ravich goes on to explain her opposition to Common Core. Quote, the creation was neither grassroots nor did it emanate from the states. In fact, it was well understood by the states that they would not be eligible for a race to the top funding unless they adopted Common Core standards. Federal law prohibits the U.S. Department of Education from prescribing any curriculum. But in this case, the department figured out a clever way to evade the letter of the law. 46 states and the District of Columbia signed on, not because Common Core standards were better than their own, but because they wanted their share of federal cash, end quote. The response from Common Core supporters regarding the federal overreach has been surprisingly weak. Michelle Rhee, the former chancellor of the D.C. Public Schools and a well-known education reformer, which I oftentimes I kind of find myself agreeing with her, is a strong supporter of Common Core. In a speech just last week on Mackinac Island in my home state to political leaders and to business people, she said this, quote, the vast majority of states have adopted the standards. I've heard some rumblings from people who say, we don't like when the federal government is telling us what to do. We don't like that. You know what you should not like? The fact that China is kicking our rear ends right now. Get over feeling bad about the federal government and feel bad that our kids are not competing, end quote. I certainly hope that our country's commitment to the Constitution does not simply hang on something as fragile as a feeling that we are able to get over. Rhee's cavalier critique of those who are concerned about federal overreach is troubling, but I, for one, appreciate her honesty. Most supporters of Common Core try to hide behind words like state-led and voluntary. But anyone willing to take an honest look at what transpired between 2009 and 2011 would conclude that many of these cash-strapped states, already under the burden of a budget shortfall and expensive NCLB requirements, were seduced by a high-pressured, time-sensitive sales pitch for adopting the standards that included relief in the form of money and waivers. Yes, the states are ultimately responsible for selling their constitutional birthright for a bowl of porridge, and given more time, perhaps many more states might have rejected a poor bargain like this. But perhaps it's not too late. Initially, Common Core experienced widespread support. Even some prominent Republicans were strong supporters of it, like Jeb Bush of Florida, Chris Christie of New Jersey, and Mitch Daniels of Indiana. But support for Common Core seems to be weakening, and some states that originally had adopted the standards are starting to take a second look. This spring, the Michigan House of Representatives voted essentially to defund the implementation of Common Core. In Indiana, the state Senate voted to delay implementation of Common Core so that the State Board of Education could take a closer look at the quality, cost, and the loss of local control connected with the implementation of Common Core. In April, Indiana's new governor, Mike Pence, agreed to take, quote, a long, hard look, end quote, at Common Core, and quickly added that he was one of the few politicians to initially oppose the No Child Left Behind. Other states are considering legislative action to delay or defund Common Core. Within the last 9 months, the following states have held public forums or formal legislative hearings to discuss delaying or defunding Common Core: South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Missouri, Kansas, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, South Dakota, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. In April, the National Republican Committee passed an anti-Common Core resolution stating that the RNC, quote, rejects the Common Core plan which creates and fits the country with a straitjacket on academic freedom and achievement, end quote. Never to be outdone, the state of Texas reiterated its opposition to Common Core. In early May, the Texas House of Representatives formally rejected the standards by a margin of 140 to 2. Last month, a poll of education insiders, which include national and state education leaders, discovered that support for Common Core is beginning to fade. The poll showed that 63% of those polled believe that the states will implement some form of moratorium on Common Core. And it would be wrong to assume that the opposition to Common Core is coming only from the right. Recently, Randi Weingarten, the president of the second largest teachers union in the United States with 1 million members, almost 1 million members, called for a moratorium on the use of standardized tests that are connected with Common Core. Ms. Weingarten, initially a strong supporter of Common Core, is concerned that aspects of Common Core have been poorly implemented and that without a, quote, mid-course correction, the entire effort will fall apart. The idea of a common nationwide standard, the idea of common nationwide standards is appealing. And as I mentioned above, the benefits of such standard should not be ignored. But concerns over Common Core, and especially its implementation, are real and troubling. Any of these concerns, cost, mediocrity, federal overreach, are serious enough that states should consider pausing and perhaps ultimately repealing their adoption of the standards. But a much more fundamental concern exists about Common Core that goes to the heart of any educational experience. Recall the comments from Arne Duncan from the beginning of my talk. He said, we want common career-ready standards. The phrase career-ready or college and career-ready appear throughout the Common Core standards. The opening page of the Common Core document includes 8 references to college and career readiness. If any other goal is mentioned, such as literacy, it is subservient to the overarching goal. The catchphrase for Common Core, printed below its logo, is preparing American students for college and career. Common Core's mission statement reflects this notion as well. Here's the entire mission statement of Common Core. Quote, the Common Core standards provide a consistent, clear understanding of what students are expected to learn, so teachers and parents know what they need to do to help them. The standards are designed to be robust and relevant to the real world, reflecting the knowledge and skills that young people need, here it is, for success in college and careers. And the final line I want you to pay special attention to. With American students fully prepared for the future, our communities will be positioned, and here it is, to compete successfully in a global economy. End quote. With such a mission, it's easy to see why many politicians and the business leaders support Common Core. Even critics of Common Core have adopted the college and career-ready mantra and now spend much of their time arguing how Common Core will not prepare students for the working world. I understand that this line of attack is necessary if they have any hope of stopping Common Core. But what I would like for us to consider here today is whether or not career preparation for a global economy should be the ultimate education goal in America. In the 1920s and 30s, progressive educators tried to devalue impractical liberal arts education and saw schools as mechanisms for preparing students for particular roles within the social structure. During this era, schooling became job preparation. But in the ancient world, job preparation was known as a servile education because it prepared students to serve a master in a particular kind of work. A modern education theorist would say that I'm being ridiculous to associate ancient notion of servile education with skills for the 21st century, which will allow students to adapt to an ever-changing society. But as long as students are told that the end of education is a job or a career, they will forever be servants of some master. Joy Pullman, an education policy analyst for the Heartland Institute, and a Hillsdale grad, by the way, recently won the Robert Novak Award to study and write about Common Core. Pullman is quickly becoming one of the nation's experts on Common Core. At a recent hearing in Wisconsin on Common Core standards, Pullman addressed Common Core's misguided focus. In a self-governing nation, quote, in a self-governing nation, we need citizens who can govern themselves. The ability to support oneself with meaningful work is an important part, but only a part of self-government. When a nation expands workforce training so that it crowds out other things that rightly belong in education, we end up turning out neither good workers nor good citizens, end quote. The ancients knew that in order for men to be truly free, they must have a liberal education that includes study of literature and history, mathematics and science, music and art. Yes, man is made for work, but he's also made for so much more. Education should be about the highest things. We should study these things, of the stars, plant cells, square roots, Shakespeare's Hamlet, Mozart's Requiem, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, not simply because they'll get us into the right college or into the right line of work. Rather, we should study these noble things because they can tell us who we are, why we're here, what our relationship is to each other as human beings, and to the world that surrounds us, among other things. Commenting on Common Core standards, Anthony Esalen, English professor at Providence College, said this: "What appalls me most about the standards is the cavalier contempt for great works of human art and thought in literary form. It is sheer ignorance of the life of the imagination. We are not programming machines. We are teaching children. We are to be forming the minds and hearts of men and women, and we should raise them to be human beings, honoring what is good and right, and cherishing what is beautiful." If education has become, as Common Core openly declares, preparation for work in a global economy, then this situation is far worse than Common Core critics ever anticipated. And the concerns about cost and quality, and yes, even the constitutionality of Common Core pale in comparison to the concerns for the hearts, minds, and souls of Americans' children. Thank you very much.